Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Matter of the Heart. And we're so glad, always, that you take the time out to listen to heartfelt, positive, healing stories, all to elevate your spirit. I wonder, listeners, how many of you have heard of Joan of Arc? And did you know she was born January 6th, 1412? I'm sure you've heard of her name, but maybe you don't know some of the spirituality behind her. Did you know that she was also canonized by the Catholic Church? What was the siege of Orleans? And do you know, listeners, as speaking of spiritual messages, that she had received visions from Archangel Michael, Saint Margaret, and Saint Catherine of Alexander, all instructing her to recover France from English domination, which she accomplished. Well, today's topic is Joan of Arc, Vision, Voices, and Spirit. And our guest is Joshua Schmude. He is the author of Reverse Speech in Theory and Practice: How to Use Your Consciousness Mind to Predict the Outcome of Future Events. And he's also the founder of Lionheart Publishing. Welcome to the show, Joshua.
Hey, Carol, thank you for having me.
So I'm just curious, Joshua, as far as Joan of Arc goes, maybe just the human side, a little bit about her as a human being.
Yeah, so Joan of Arc is probably one of the most fascinating saints, I think, in modern times and in our modern era that we've been gracious enough to host, if you will. She, what's really interesting, especially with saints like Joan of Arc, is to look at them in the context of Jungian psychology. And what I mean by that is, you mentioned earlier, she had a vision, and it appears when you read her court transcripts, her minutes, that this was a corporal vision, or it happened during a waking state. And she claimed that in this vision, she saw Saint Margaret and Saint Catherine, and later Saint Michael, and they had told her basically exactly what you said, that she had to win France back from the English. And it's very interesting because she had this occur at the age of 13, which, if some of your listeners remember from our previous shows, according to Jung, we have a series of great dreams in our life, typically about 4. The first one occurring when we're about 6, 7 years old. The next one occurring in our adolescence, so between 12 and 14. The third one occurring sometime in our mid-20s, early 30s. And then the fourth and final one occurring sometime midlife and shortly before death. So we see a sort of textbook example, if you will, in the life of Joan of Arc, of this great dream experience. Although this wasn't a quote-unquote dream per se, it was a corporal vision. It was something that dealt with her destiny, something that struck her in a profound way, in such a way that she knew she had to do this. This was her destiny, her purpose, and eventually led to her fulfilling, I guess we could say, her greater destiny, if you will.
That's very fascinating to me, really fascinating. Yes. So do you think that gave her also strengthened her spirit?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. In a lot of the lives of the saints, we find that the majority of them have a sort of profound inner or outer experience, or both, whether it's an imaginative vision, which is a vision that occurs during sleep, or whether it's a corporeal vision, which is a vision that occurs during our waking state. They tend to have this sort of profound spiritual experience that sets them apart, I guess, if you will, from their fellow men and women, and shows them a greater destiny, a greater purpose, which I believe they probably would not have been able to accomplish had they not received this inspiration first. Because oftentimes it's the inspirations that we receive from our unconscious that kind of gives us that inner drive to pursue it and to believe in ourselves and believe that we can accomplish what our unconscious mind is showing us.
Fascinating to me, Joshua, and listeners. As well as that, what was she like as a human being? Do you know anything, just, from a personal perspective?
Yeah, she, what's interesting, her mother, Joan of Arc's mother, after Joan of Arc was burned at the stake, and I believe sometime around 1430, if I'm not mistaken, or 1431, May 30th, 1431, around 19 years of age, they actually took care of her mother. Her mother's name was Isabel Rome, if I'm not mistaken, and she was given a pension by the town for the rest of her life. The city actually loved and cared for her and paid her a monthly pension of 48 sous until her death. So she was highly revered. But Joan herself, from reading the minutes of her trials, Joan is a very witty young woman, definitely an educated young woman. She was what's so fascinating about her trial is she was answering the questions by her interrogators in such a way that she was turning the trial back around on them. She was outwitting them, if you will, and very, very interesting. She eventually recanted her visions. They had led her to the stake. They were going to burn her alive. And she said, well, look, I'm going to recant, basically. And she signed the recantation, which saved her life momentarily. But about a week later, she renounced that and said that her voices had told her she'd done a bad thing and she's not to renounce this destiny that she was given. And she basically, she signed her own death warrant. But I think that she was very, very savvy. I think she's a very savvy young woman. She definitely was very courageous. And really at the time that the siege of Orleans was taking place, this is a teenage young woman and she's leading an army. So, it's just absolutely, in our modern standards, it would be absolutely, we'd be flabbergasted if we saw something like that in our modern world now. But I definitely think, just reading her minutes, that she was very articulate, very savvy, and she had a definite sense of purpose and destiny.
That's fascinating to me. So with that, or linking that, Joshua, you're saying she also had a vision that she would be?
Well, what she had claimed, because she wouldn't tell her interrogators everything about her visions. They made her swear an oath, and the way she got around that question is she basically said, look, I'll swear, but I'm not going to swear. I don't know what questions you're asking me, and there's some questions basically that I'm not going to tell you no matter how much you ask. There's some things that are only for me, basically, some things that have been revealed to me that you are not to know. And apparently she knew much more than she let on, because when she met King Charles VII before the siege of Orleans to basically ask him to put her out on the field and let her win him his crown, basically, when she went and talked to him, although they don't know exactly what was said, it's reported that King Charles VII said she told him things that only God could know. So she must have told him something very personal about himself or about his reign that nobody else could have known. So she struck a chord with King Charles VII. And it's really sad, because when you look at the history, he really didn't do anything to try and save her, and he could have. He could have tried to save her. He could have offered, money. He could have tried to break her out, but he didn't try any of that. Eventually, 20 years after her death, they did have a retrial, basically, and cleared her name. But I think that wasn't so much King Charles VII as it was Joan's mother. Joan's mother really fought for her daughter 20 years later and demanded, basically, that they right the wrongs that were done. So on November 7th, 1445, her mother was about 60, 70 years old, and her two sons, or her brothers, Joan of Arc's brothers, came to the Cathedral of Notre Dame and approached the Pope and the judges and began to recite a request for justice for her daughter. So really, Joan's mother was just as strong as Joan was herself. And it seemed that although Joan of Arc was filled with this sense of purpose and the sense of destiny and this courage, the king that she was fighting for didn't seem to share that same courage and didn't do enough, in my opinion, to try and help her out of this situation.
So obviously, how old was she? She was only, what, in her 30s when she died?
No, she was 19. She got burned alive at 19 years old. Yeah, so I mean, this woman lived a full life by the time she was 19. I mean,
wow.
You got to think, this is a 16-year-old girl leading an army at the siege of Orleans, which is what made her famous. Right. It's reported that she was dressed in white armor and she was riding a white horse, but she led several French assaults against the English there, and in 9 days she lifted the siege. So this is a 16-year-old girl that lifted the siege in 9 days that had been going on for quite some time. So I mean, it's just incredible when you really look into her life, what she was able to accomplish.
So based on you have obviously Jungian background and your own spiritual philosophy of life, Joshua, why do you think that she died at such a young age? Or is it that we're not supposed to be looking at the age, or more the events that she pursued?
Right. So from a Jungian perspective, I think that all of us, regardless of whatever religion you are, I think that all of us have an innate destiny. It's this sort of, think of it like a symbolic imprint on our unconscious, right? And this symbolic imprint is the meaning and goal of life, discovering what this is consciously. So what I mean by that is the meaning of life in my personal perspective, from my personal perspective, is the uncovering of one's own destiny. It is the realization of the greater personality within oneself. So looking at Joan's life from this perspective, she was one of the few, from a Jungian sense, who actually embraced individuation. That is, she was shown her destiny at 13 through this corporeal vision, and rather than running from it, which a lot of people will do, she actually fully embraced it and, went headfirst into her destiny, regardless of the consequences, which takes a lot of courage to be able to do that. So looking at her life from that perspective, I think that all of us, and we talked about this in the previous shows, all of us have these series of great dreams that happen to us in our life, and they mark distinct phases of our biological and spiritual development. So from 6 years old into teenage years, there's a definite physical change that is happening at the time that this great dream occurs. So think of life as a series of those great dreams with tiny dreams interspersed through each one of those 4 great dreams. And when you start looking at it like this, and the development of personality in this sense, Joan of Arc was one of the few that, upon receiving this great dream at that age, she actually embraced it and met her destiny head first. Whereas a lot of people, and Jung says this explicitly in many of his writings, when the image of the self arises, it frightens people, because it's not what their ego wants. They begin to understand that there's this other, as Jung called it, this other within them that seems to already have a charted course for your life. And in many instances, this charted course can be completely at odds with the course that you've charted for yourself consciously. There's something deeper that is meant than what you consciously have conceived for your life. And she was brave enough to actually, follow through and listen to these visions. And I think, one, it led to her greatness, but two, it also led to her downfall. And just to kind of summarize what I'm saying there, Jung also believed that these archetypes, there is a danger of the inflation of the ego. And what Jung meant by that is when one begins to believe they are the symbol rather than an expression of the symbol. So, for example, one might have a vision of Jesus. And in this vision of Jesus, Jesus tells them, look, you've got a great destiny. You're going to go do this and lead my people out of bondage, right? And this person, after having this inner experience of Jesus, quote unquote, begins to think that they are Jesus, begins to think that they themselves are the symbol rather than a conscious expression of that symbol. So I think where Joan kind of messed up is she put her full faith in these voices and thought that if she just followed them without tempering them with her own consciousness and her own ego, which is what we should do, then she just went headfirst into her doom rather than looking at these visions with a tempered rationality and saying, okay, yes, I am seeing these things. What does this mean? How can I manifest these things without endangering myself? Because many times when we get visions and stuff like this, getting to that vision, to that final destination shown in the vision, can require a lot of hardship and a lot of things that the dreamer is not aware of, a lot of obstacles, right, that they have to hurdle over, if you will. And if they are not sufficiently prepared, if they have not kind of stepped back from the situation and not get so wrapped up in the unconscious and actually try and look at it rationally, try and judge the irrational by the rational and say, yes, I'm seeing these images. This is what I think they mean. How can I consciously integrate them? I think that we can have a sort of say in that overall process of transformation. So I think if Joan would have had Jungian psychology, she probably could have benefited from it because she would have understood that, yes, I am having these inner experiences. No, I should not just jump into them head first and not use my brain at the same time and try and really analyze what these voices are telling me to do, because they are looking at humanity from a collective sense, if you will, whereas Joan is not looking at her own life from a personal perspective, but looking at it from one of a higher power is guiding me, a higher power is leading me to this. This higher power will take care of everything for me. And as comforting as that may seem, if you give that higher power all the power, if you will, and just kind of let it run amok, 9 times out of 10, it could also lead to your ruin. So that's kind of the danger with the unconscious is the way in which these inner experiences are integrated consciously that matters. And they can be integrated in a positive way, or they can be integrated in a very negative way, depending on how the ego receives these images and how it decides to try and integrate them in its own life.
Right. So in other words, what I'm picking up, Joshua and listeners, is the ego is the interference at times when we receive major dreams in our life. How to interpret it for a higher level.
Right. The ego kind of acts as a mediator, if you will, between our unconscious dreams and our conscious reality, right? It's kind of in the middle, if you will. And it is the job of the ego to correctly assimilate these unconscious images, right? That is to discover what the unconscious mind is trying to say, and once this is discovered, consciously integrate it in a way that's positive, not just for the individual themselves, but for humanity as a whole. So yes, the ego has an important job in being that sort of middleman that can integrate these contents in a positive way, or it can integrate these contents in a way that could be ultimately destructive.
I'm picking up the word neutral, not to get attached to the messages. I mean, obviously, what you're saying is there's a wonderful, at the same time, to me, story, and behind all this that we can, if we embrace or listen or do journal writing or dream journals, you know, whatever visions or messages we get with our you're saying four major dreams, that this can certainly help us or guide us to our mission to our own mission of life.
Right. Yes, it can guide us or it can destroy us, you know, and this is kind of the catch-22.
Mm-hmm.
It depending on how these unconscious dreams are consciously integrated,
Mm-hmm.
depending on how they are perceived and how they are used by the conscious mind, really determines the destiny and the effect that these symbols have. So integrating them in a positive way will lead to an abundant, you know, a life of abundance, a life of fulfillment, of joy, of peace. But integrating them in a negative way could lead to a neurosis, which is a split in personality. It can also lead to the destruction of the person themselves, you know, by their own hand. So it's really important that the individual realizes the role that their conscious ego plays between outer reality and inner reality. And, you know, there's one quote I want to mention. This is about Joan and all the other saints. What's very funny with religion in general is religions are founded by experiences like the one Joan of Arc had. So what I mean by that is a genuine firsthand religious experience like that of Paul or Joan of Arc. The individual who has this experience is the prophet, if you will, and that prophet founds the religion. That religion begins to dogmatize the truth, right? That spirit of inspiration out of the religion as it tries to articulate the event. So what I mean by that is religion, the Latin word for religion, is derived from the Latin, which means religio, and that is to link back. So what a religion is trying to do typically is to link back to that last time when the divine, quote unquote, incarnated in matter, or when this genuine firsthand religious experience had taken place. And a really popular book written by William James, he's the founder of psychological pragmatism. It's called The Varieties of Religious Experience. He made this quote, and I want your listeners to think about this. A genuine firsthand religious experience like that of George Fox, he was the founder of the Quakers, is bound to be a heterodoxy to its witnesses. That is something unorthodox, right? It's something out there, right? The prophet appearing as a mere lonely madman. If his doctrine proves contagious enough to spread to any others, it becomes a definite and labeled heresy. But if it then still proved contagious enough to triumph over persecution, which is what happened with Christianity, it becomes itself an orthodoxy. That is, it becomes a traditional, established, you know, traditional faith. And when a religion becomes an orthodoxy, its day of inwardness is over. The spring is dry. The faithful live at second hand, exclusively, and stone the prophets in their turn. The new church, in spite of whatever human goodness it may foster, can henceforth be counted on as a staunch ally in every attempt to stifle the spontaneous religious spirit and to stop all later bubblings of the fountain from which in pure days it drew its own supply of inspiration. So just wow. I mean, that quote sums up religion and the history of religion right there. And that's what happened with Joan of Arc. She had this genuine firsthand religious experience. And typically when somebody has these experiences, they're not going to be orthodox. They're not going to fit in with all the doctrines and dogmas created by men because they were spontaneous. And this is what Jung calls the divine numinosum. Right, the numinous, the divine experience, or the experience of the numinosity of divinity. Right, so it is this divine inner experience which Jung was trying to quantify, if you will, and empirically observe, and which religions have been founded upon. It is that very inner experience that is the kernel of truth in all revealed religions, if you will.
That's beautiful what you said. So, and how is Joan of Arc looked at today? I know there's many different opinions, but in a very, very general, broad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She was canonized, I believe, in 1920, if I'm not mistaken, by the Catholic Church. I believe she's become the patron saint of France. So yeah, she's actually looked at as a saint in the Catholic Church, and she definitely, I think she's going to be remembered in history as somebody who heard voices and listened to them. So regardless of what her destiny, what happened and her being burned at the stake, there's one thing you can't say about Joan of Arc, and that is that she didn't fulfill, or she didn't live an unfulfilled life, that she lived a life full of meaning and purpose. And in that 19 years of life that she had on this earth, she accomplished more and experienced more than most people will experience in their entire 80, 90-year lives in our modern era. So I think that Joan of Arc is very respected now, and I think she's an example to all religions about following the advice of your inner self, that inner voice that we all have, that God within us, and letting it lead you, but letting it lead you being tempered with consciousness. So drawing your inspiration from this inner greater personality, but at the same time not thinking it's infallible and it's going to lead you the right way without you actually having to use your conscious mind and really try to rationalize and systemize things through. So I think that's the greatest lesson we can learn from Joan of Arc is that she was a woman who had these inner experiences, and rather than running from them, met them head on with courage and faith, and became one of the greatest saints in history.
That's a great story. And that's something for all of us to remember, listeners. Courage and faith are probably two of the most important factors, right? Qualities that we can have to go forward in our lives. When you have courage, you're going to face it. When you have faith, you believe. You go to the next step, no matter what.
Yep.
And secure with yourself. Well, this is a fascinating a woman who still lives in spirit. Joshua, it's unbelievable story, really an unbelievable story. And of course, when I can't help but think of these major dreams also maybe are linked to people that their destiny is to serve mankind on a very universal,
Yes, on a universal scale. Yeah, definitely. The ancients believed that people that had these types of missions, these were initiates in a past life, that just initiation carries over to each new life. I think you're right. I think we all have a very special purpose, and that's unique to us. But some of us have a more collective purpose, while others tend to be more individualistic. But I think ultimately we're all connected, and we're all not only helping ourselves, but helping each other, whether we consciously realize it or not, fulfilling our own destinies, right? So not only are we fulfilling our own, but through our actions, we're helping others fulfill theirs without even really realizing it.
Collective bloodstream, I'm picturing.
Right.
Yep. Continuously.
Exactly.
Like the ripples of the water. They were all part
of exactly.
It, right, Joshua?
Yep.
Fascinating, Joshua. Thank you so very, very much.
Yes.
With this beautiful insight into a very courageous woman at the age of 19. And I guess, Joshua and listeners, it doesn't matter what the number is as far as the age, woman, teenage, it doesn't matter. It's the essence, it's the soul of the person who is charging forward. I can picture on a horse, actually, charging forward with the sword and spiritual warrior.
Yeah, I mean, It's the courage that she met her destiny with is a courage I think that we should all hope to meet our own destinies with. And sometimes you might have a great dream that scares the bejesus out of you, and I can testify to that. I've had, you know, one that still kind of haunts me, if you will. But I also am understanding that it is a part of my own destiny, is a part of what my mission is, and there is no running from it. And I think once people realize that you're here for a reason, you have a unique purpose special to you. And sometimes it takes a tragedy in your life. It takes something very bad to happen to you to slap you upside your head and say, hey, you're not going down the right path, buddy. This is where you need to be. So don't try to flee from tragedies in your life and think that life is all about being happy and living in Candyland. No, life is about growing, and that requires both happiness and sadness, pleasure and pain, because it's only through that polarity, through opposites, that real growth is made possible, because you cannot know something without having its opposite to compare it to. We couldn't know good unless we had its opposite, evil, to compare it to. I mean, this is how we know something. So if there's anything that your listeners take from this particular interview, just meet that inner destiny that you have with the same courage that Joan of Arc met hers, and realize that, you know, death is just rebirth into a new life in many respects. At least this is what I believe through my experiences. But whatever your faith is, or whatever you believe, just know that there's something inside of you that is divine. And if you listen to it, it will lead you on to the path of your greater destiny.
That makes a lot of sense. And just to, well, I couldn't help it when you're talking about the good and the bad, the duality, the polarity. When something is negative or seems to be negative, listeners, it turns around to actually create more courage and more faith.
Right.
Right?
Yep, exactly. Yep. When one door closes, a window opens, another one opens somewhere else. So as bad as things may be in your life right now, we might have a listener listening to this and they've had a bunch of tragedies happen. Know that oftentimes our life will use tragedies to lead us on to that path of our greater destiny, and not to flee from these tragedies, not to blame God for the tragedies, but to accept them and embrace them just as equally as your happy moments, and realize that this is just as essential in your growth as having happiness and having love. So once you look at tragedies and sadness in that same respect, I think you'll have a much better life, because then you're not living a life that is focused on, oh, I just want to be happy in my life, because that's not, in my mind, the end-all pursuit of life. Life is supposed to be painful. Life is supposed to have some sadness, you know, and it's supposed to have joy, and it's supposed to have pleasure and happiness. But I think we shouldn't lean on any one over the other, and we should learn to embrace and accept both equally.
All right. I was just going to accept what is given to you at the moment by the Creator. Well, this is fascinating, Josh. Really fascinating. Thank you so very, very much.
Not a problem.
Valuable, humanistic information.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. No problem. Yeah, it's in the paperback edition of my book, that quote I read, but the paperback edition of Reverse Speech in Theory and Practice has been out for a few months now. It has 100 additional pages of content that aren't in the ebook, and it does have a sneak peek at my next book, which is Unveiling the Self, a Psychodynamic Approach to Spiritual Enlightenment. So if they want to read more, go ahead and check out that paperback. But this next book I'm going to be coming out with is really going to put things into perspective spiritually. So I think I could give people a better understanding of not only what I believe, but sort of my spiritual philosophy in life, and how I view things, and what I think life is all about. So it's going to be very spiritual, and I hope that they can check it out and pick it up. One thing I also want to tell them is me and Susan Brender started a podcast. It's called The High Life. And if they just Google High Life, HIGHLIFE, and then Joshua Schmude or Susan Brender, the show will come up. It's available on most major platforms. But check out that show, guys. We're having some really interesting guests coming on, and it's It's going to be all about just knowledge and learning things that can help you out in your life, and hopefully make your life that much better, that much more fulfilling. So I just want to let your listeners know, check out High Life, and hopefully you guys can learn some new things.
Okay. Okay. Thanks so much, Joshua Schmude. Thank you.
No problem. You take care, Carol.
You've been listening to The Matter of the Heart. And we always say, be kind to your heart and have faith and courage in your soul. Thanks so much, everybody, for listening. This is Carol from The Matter of the Heart.